All right, everybody, welcome back for Section 6 of Introduction to Criminal Justice. We are going to continue on with our law enforcement subject. Yay! All right, I know everybody's super excited. So we are going to start with our funny picture of the section. Funny, right? Spider-Man and like weird entomologists and stuff. But yeah, so Spider-Man, that would be very, very different if that was his superpower, I think. But anyway, so we're going to talk a little bit about professionalism, right? So as we talked about in the last section, law enforcement was not always a thing that was well respected or professional or followed rules and laws. And you know, for a long time, throughout a lot of relatively modern history, police were just there, or the precursors to police were just there to kind of make sure that nobody got too loud and nobody got too violent and nobody got too out of hand, right? They were there to rule their little beat with an iron fist and through any means necessary make sure that their area of the city didn't become a problem, right? But throughout the 20th century, they decided to get more and more and more professional, right? And there are three. When the word profession or professional was first coined, there were really three jobs that they were talking about. There were the three professions. That was medicine, law, and the clergy. Those were the three jobs that were described as professional or professions. But since then, obviously, our language has migrated, and now we talk about lots of different jobs or careers as professions. But if you want to be professional, you have to act professional, and you have to have different ways of regulating yourselves or letting someone else kind of top-down regulate you, right? So the first thing we have to do if we want policing or law enforcement to become a profession is to develop standard operating procedure, i.e. we need to have a set of rules and regulations for how we're going to act in different situations, right? Now, a lot of this in law enforcement comes down from elected bodies, right? Whether it's the U.S. Congress, a state legislature, a city council, whatever. A lot of this comes down kind of from above. But there also needs to be standard operating procedures that come from within the profession, right? So legally, you know, the things that come down from Congress might say, and certain states have this, where if a police officer goes into a domestic violence situation and one member of this domestic violence argument has physical injuries, bruises, cuts, etc., they must arrest the other person. That is a standard operating procedure that comes from the law. But there's also standard operating procedures that come from within police departments and police organizations themselves. So, when are you allowed to or expected to go to a call with your lights and sirens going? And when are you expected to just kind of go as fast as you can without the lights and sirens? And when are you expected to just kind of get to it when you get to it, right? That is a standard operating procedure regulation that comes from within policing itself and is set by the organization. But there are a lot of general rules that all police organizations follow that they've kind of learned from each other, right? How do you wear your uniforms, right? Where does the badge go on your uniform? Does it go on your left or your right? You know, even simple things like that are part of standard operating procedure. And if you want to be professional, you have to develop those standard operating procedures for, you know, law enforcement in this case as a whole, or at least most of them, or have some kind of rules and regulations that we all follow just because we want to be seen as professionals, right? Step 2 is training. We talked a lot about training in a previous section, but training, and it's not just training our bodies, but also training our minds, right? So it's everything from, you know, if you're going to be a SWAT officer, they don't just hand you a gun and a special uniform and say, oh, there you go, you're a SWAT officer now. No, you have to go through extensive training on things like, breaching tactics and how to use flashbangs and how to use a RAM and how to do, sniper school and small unit tactics and all these things. And you have to do not only the physical, right? You have to be in great physical shape. You have to know how to breach a door. You have to know how to, assault a person with a hostage. You have to know how to, sneak in and use this and use that and use distractions and all these things. But you also have to have the mental component, right? You have to understand why you're doing what you're doing, right? Why do you not use flashbangs in certain situations? Like if you're busting a meth lab, why do you use a flashbang or not? Why do you, do all these things? So there's both the mental component and the physical component of that training, but it is so important that we don't just say, oh, you want to be a canine officer? Here's a dog. Have fun, right? You need to know what you're doing. You need to be ready to deal with what that slightly different job is going to bring you over and above what you've been trained to do just as every other police officer, right? We need to have a code of ethics, right? So your code of ethics is over and above what police are legally required to do, right? So a code of ethics wouldn't say, hey, we probably shouldn't shoot people. That's a legal matter, not an ethical matter, right? So the code of ethics is designed for things like, you need to be polite. Even when citizens are being rude to you, even if they're calling, oh, you dirty pig, you still need to be polite to them. You still need to treat them with the respect they deserve as a person, even if they're not treating you with the respect you deserve, either as a person or as an officer of the law. Now, if that abuse becomes illegal, i.e. they spit on you or they try to hit you or whatever, then there are obvious things that you can do as a police officer, from arresting them to citing them or whatever. But you still need to treat people with respect. Other code of ethics things like, you will not take a bribe or anything even approaching a bribe. You don't, if you go into a coffee shop and they're like, hey, here's a free coffee for being a police officer because we love you, many code of ethics will say, no, that's like too close to bribery, even though there's not a hey, we'll give you this free coffee if you overlook this other thing. Taking any kind of gift or thing like that is still too close to a bribe for comfort, for this code of ethics. So these codes of ethics, every police organization either has them or should have them, but those are a very good guide to how police officers should act in kind of that day-to-day activity, in that dealing with the public and dealing with their coworkers, right? That's another area that anybody in any organization, but especially law enforcement, needs to treat their coworkers and their superiors and the people that work under them all with respect, and there are special parts of that just for law enforcement. Then there needs to be somebody that can hold police officers accountable for violations either of law or violations of these code of ethics. And there's two big common ways to do that. The first is a citizen complaint board, right? So there's a group of people that are not police officers. Some of them might be police officers, but they're outside of the policing organization. They might be city professionals, members of the city council, or just volunteers from the community, or former police officers, or whatever. And they have a board, a group of these people that meet and they discuss citizen complaints, right? So if I'm just any other citizen and a police officer is especially mean to me or does something illegal to me or, whatever, as a citizen, I call up that complaint board and say, hey, this officer did this. I saw him taking a bribe. I saw him cursing out a person. I saw him, doing this other thing that's unprofessional or illegal. Can you please investigate him? And then the citizen complaint board will take those complaints, investigate, determine punishment, determine guilt or whatever. Obviously, this is, if it is a legal issue and these complaint boards find that the officers broke the law, it gets sent to the city or county or state prosecutor. But if it's something that's just violating the code of ethics, the Citizen Complaint Board in many cases will have a way to discipline the officer up to and including, firing them. The alternative way to do it, sometimes the Citizen Complaint Board and this way are used in conjunction, but most commonly it's one or the other, is to have an internal affairs group, right? So essentially it's a subdivision of the police that is there to police the police, right? So internal affairs are police department officers who work for the police department, but their job is to investigate other police officers, right? So if I get accused of taking a bribe, I'm just a normal patrol officer, I'm out and about, oh, I heard so-and-so, he took a bribe. The internal affairs group is going to come in and investigate me and determine if I took that bribe or not, and if so, they can send it up to the prosecutor, or if it's just an ethical thing, not a legal thing, they could recommend, a suspension or a decrease in pay or a demotion or firing, whatever. But usually there's at least one of the two. Occasionally you'll find both, but those two ways to kind of govern and ensure the professionalism of law enforcement are very important. So let's say I'm a police officer. I have arrested a suspect. I take him back to the jail. Now I want to interrogate him. I want to find out what he knows, find out, see if I can get any evidence that he did in fact commit the crime, or maybe he's, I think he had a partner, I want to find out who his partner is, etc. The ultimate goal of an interrogation, what would be great, is to get a confession. To get the suspect to say, yeah, it was me, I did it, I admit it, I'm sorry, let's go to court. But there are rules to these confessions. Okay, police officers can't just do whatever they want during these interrogations. Okay, first off, the most important rule is that confessions cannot be coerced. The police cannot threaten or actually perform any kind of physical violence or threat of violence in order to get a person to confess. Right? This was not always the case. Back in the early 20th century, there were kind of famous cases of police officers using either physical force or the threats of physical force. Like, if you don't confess to this, I'm going to hit you, or I'm going to leave you tied to that chair overnight, or I'm going to do something that is physically painful or whatever. But over the course of the 20th century, the courts have made sure to come down very hard on this. So these days it is very, very rare. Police officers know that either physical violence or threats of physical violence will get that confession tossed out very quickly by a judge. During interrogation, suspects do absolutely have the right to counsel, right? So remember, when you get arrested, you get read your Miranda rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you. You have the right to an attorney, right? So if a person says, looks at the police officer and says, I want my lawyer, the police at that point have to stop questioning the person, get them a lawyer, and then continue the questioning with the presence of that person's lawyer. Does that mean the law enforcement have to stop talking? No, law enforcement can still say things to the defendant, can still, by the way, your bail is set at, your first appearance, your bail is set at this, or, please go into this room, or, here's what we're going to charge you with, or whatever. So the law enforcement can talk at the defendant, they just can't ask them any questions. Was it you who did it? Who is your partner? Why did you kill the person? Where'd you hide the stolen money? Anything like that. They can't ask any questions. Now, here's something that's occasionally very misunderstood by a lot of students. During interrogation, and in fact, all throughout the investigation, police are absolutely legally allowed to lie to you. They can lie all they want. Basically, with a few exceptions, the only time police aren't allowed to lie is when they're in court. If they're on the stand, they're not allowed to lie. But other than that, in the interrogation, in the investigation, there are a few things they're not allowed to lie about, but for the most part, they're allowed to lie to you whatever they want. And in fact, it is a very common police tactic. If you arrest two people and you suspect them of committing, say, a burglary, right? You put those two people in two different rooms. You let them stew for an hour, right? Then you go into the first room and you say, hey, your buddy over there in that other room, he's rolling over on you. My partner's in there right now listening to him confess to this crime, and he's going to get treated a lot better by the judge because he's confessing. So if you want to get treated better, you should probably confess too and tell me all about this crime. And if he doesn't, you go into the second room and you say, hey, the guy in the first room, he's confessing, to all this stuff, and he's going to get treated better by the judge. And neither one of the two guys is actually confessing, but you are perfectly allowed to lie and say that the other guy is in the middle of spilling his guts to your partner, and if you want the same deal he got, you better confess too. So that is legally allowed to do. The police are allowed to lie to you about stuff like that in order to get you to give up information. Okay. Now those Miranda warnings, somebody absolutely has the right to remain silent. They have the right to a lawyer. They have all those things, but there are exceptions to that. Okay. First exception to Miranda is in some states, people are legally required to give identification to the police, even if they, are not suspected of a crime. The police can just walk up to basically anybody on the street and say, hey, who are you? Identify yourself. And you are legally required to identify yourself if the police officer asks you. So your right to remain silent does not apply to any kind of identification, right? The easiest way to do that, obviously, is with a driver's license, but they can also have you do it, just saying, oh, my name is this and my birth date is that and blah, blah, blah. But the police are legally allowed to question you about your identity, and that does not violate Miranda. If police are allowed to ask you questions, even if you said, I choose to remain silent, or I want my lawyer, or whatever, they are allowed to ask you questions as long as they are prepared to not use your answers against you in court. Right? Because that's basically what the Miranda rights mean. They mean, if I ask you questions and you answer them, if I want to use them against you in court, you have to know these rights. I can violate your rights all I want, but the information I get from that I can't use against you in court. But that might be useful, right? So let's say you arrest a guy because you're pretty sure he planted a bomb somewhere. Right? And you read him his Miranda rights and he says, I want to remain silent, I want my lawyer. Police might want to keep asking him, like, where did you get the bomb? Where did you put the bomb? Where is it? We need to find it. We need to rescue people. But, and then if he says, oh, okay, fine, the bomb is in such and such a place. They can go find that bomb, disarm it, defuse it, whatever, save some lives, but then they can't mention during the trial at all that person said, oh, yes, the bomb is hidden in such and such a place, right? They have lost the ability to use that information in court. But sometimes that, if that means saving lives, you might do that anyway. Other exceptions to Miranda are things like if the suspect just says something without being asked about it, right? So you've advised the person their Miranda rights. They said, I'm choosing to remain silent. You stick them in the back of the police car. You're driving the suspect from the scene of the crime to the police department. And the law enforcement officer is just, not asking any questions, just driving. And all of a sudden from the back seat, he hears the suspect say, yeah, I killed him. He was being really mean and blah, blah, blah. And, I took out my knife and I stabbed him. Because that wasn't in response to a law enforcement question, it's still perfectly admissible, right? So just because he said, I am choosing to remain silent, that doesn't mean nothing he says can be used against him. It means nothing he says in response to a question can be used against him. Make sense? All right. There are other exceptions to Miranda. You'll learn about those and probably an evidence and procedure class or something like that. So, let's say a police agency, a police officer, or a police department as a whole are just terrible. They're doing the wrong things. They're messing up. They violate people's rights. They do false arrest. They, do any of these things. The most obvious punishment for that is that they can't use the evidence in court. And we'll talk about what that exactly means in a later section. But another thing we can do if a police officer violates your rights is a civil lawsuit. Okay, so we're moving out of criminal law now into civil law, where we're going to do a tort or we're going to sue somebody for something, right? In this case, if a police officer, say, violates your rights, you have the option to sue that police officer. Now, are you going to sue just the police officer? No, why not? The police officer doesn't have any money. You know how much police officers make? I mean, they can make a decent amount of money, but it's really not that much, right? So you're going to sue the police officer, you're going to sue his department, and you're going to sue the city, right? Because it's their fault that police officer violated your rights. They have some culpability in that violation of your rights. They didn't train him enough, they didn't supervise him well enough, etc., etc. So, the downside is with police departments, police officers have a certain amount of qualified immunity, meaning you can't sue them for certain things, okay? And essentially this gets real complicated real fast, and I'm not a lawyer, so if you want to know whether a certain situation applies to this or not, consult a lawyer, not me. But the general kind of rule of thumb is that if the police officer was acting in such a way that he was acting according to training, he or she was doing what we wanted them to do according to law, according to policy, and there was some random chance that made it screw up. There was some random chance thing that happened and it stinks and it resulted in an injury or a loss of property or whatever, you can't sue. If police officers are doing their job in the way that they're supposed to do within the law and within procedure, and something bad happens anyway, they have immunity from that, okay? Now, let's say they weren't doing the right thing. Whatever they were acting on was outside of the law or outside of policy or outside of reasonableness, right? Then we can sue them. We can sue them, the department, the city, on up. In a civil trial against a police department, or really anybody, in any kind of civil trial, there are two different kinds of damages. There's actual damages and there's punitive damages. Actual damages are the things that actually happen. So let's say because of this police officer's actions, they damaged my car, right? I can sue for actual damages, which would be the cost to fix my car. Plus, the cost of a rental car while it was being fixed. Plus, if I got injured in the situation, the cost of the hospital bills, plus the cost of lost wages because I couldn't go to work. Those are actual damages, right? I can quantify those. I can provide a mathematical formula. I can provide a receipt. I can provide documentation that their actions impacted me monetarily this much, right? There's also what's called punitive damages. This is essentially money that the court will make the person pay in order to punish them, right? So if it's found that the police officers acted improperly, they did something wrong, it caused me to get in a car wreck, which caused me to go to the hospital, I'll get the actual damages, i.e. the fixing of the car and the hospital bills and all that. But the court might also instruct the police department to pay punitive damages. So over and above my actual damages, they'll also order the police department to pay me $500,000 not because they cost me $500,000, but just to punish the police department. So they will learn their lesson. They will learn, like, don't do this again. Let's make sure your people are trained not to do this. The famous case where that came into play was the McDonald's case. Hopefully we've all heard of this, we've all heard the legend of the hot coffee in McDonald's, right? And the legend is an old lady goes up to a McDonald's drive-thru, orders coffee, spills it in her lap, and sues the McDonald's company for millions of dollars because she didn't know coffee was hot. She's so stupid, but oh my God, the jury actually believed her and gave her millions of dollars because she didn't know coffee was hot. That's essentially a myth. What really happened was this old lady ordered a coffee from drive-thru McDonald's. The cup basically disintegrated in her lap, causing third-degree burns all over her legs and crotch. Because McDonald's was serving their coffee not just hot, but literally too hot for human consumption. Like, it was way hotter than any human could possibly consume it. And that's the temperature they were serving their coffee. And so this little old lady went up and sued for actual damages. All she wanted was her hospital bills paid by the McDonald's company. That's all she wanted. The jury in this civil trial heard her story and said, okay, not only are we going to give you damages, we are going to punish the McDonald's Corporation for doing this and make them pay you millions of dollars, whatever it was, right? So that is the slightly more factual version of that kind of urban legend. But it was really the old lady was in the right on that one, right? Like, McDonald's was serving coffee literally too hot for human consumption. But let's say this isn't enough. The entire department is just doing terribly. It's not functioning the way it should function. Corruption is rampant. Nobody's doing their job. Essentially, the federal government can come down and do what's called a consent decree, which is essentially, hey, we are taking over your police department. We're firing the chief. We're firing everybody that we can find evidence has been doing the wrong thing. We're going to bring in our own people. You have to do this. You have to change this rule. You have to change these policies. Hire these people. Hire these people. And essentially, the federal government can come in and say, we're taking over. And, for 2 years or 4 years or however long, they can come in, completely revamp the organization, fix all those problems, and then once the problems are fixed, and it usually takes years, they can say, okay, now you're on your own again, right? It's called a consent decree. It's essentially the death penalty for a police department or police agency, right? All right, so this was section 6.1. We're going to come back with 6.2 and talk a little bit about warrants, the warrant requirement, and more importantly, exceptions to the warrant requirement. So I will see you then.